Welcome, welcome. Here we are today in association with Hotel Solutions Partnership to talk about a very timely and important topic, ESG in hotel investment and finance. My name is Eloise Hansen. I'm the editor of Boutique Hotel News. We're an online B2B multimedia site for boutique, lifestyle and luxury hotels. A short overview of how this webinar is going to run. We're going to spend around 45, maybe 50 minutes or so in discussion with our panel today, with some time at the end to take any questions from the audience. So please, I encourage you all, if you are tuning in today, please do submit your questions using the Q&A function, and I'll keep my beady eyes on the chat. And I will ask these as and when relevant. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. So all those that have registered will receive a recording within 48 hours. So here's our panel today, and I am going to hand over to each to introduce themselves. And I'm going to move from left to right as per your screens, which means Katrina, I'm handing over to you first.
Thanks, Eloise. Hello, everyone. I'm Katrina Craig, CEO of Hotel Solutions Partnership. We advise owners, investors, and operators of hotels and hospitality units globally. I've been interested in ESG for a very long time, since it was called CSR back in the day. I chaired the International Hotels Environmental Initiative in the Philippines, where my early career was, and I was also a founding board member of World Wildlife Fund in the Philippines.
Thanks so much, Katrina. And Siobhan, I'm coming to you next, please.
Yeah, thank you, Eloise. So my name is Siobhan Cross. I'm a partner in the real estate team at law firm Pinsent Masons. And recently I've taken on the role of leading on embedding sort of climate change and environmental issues in the work we do for the real estate sector, which obviously also includes the hotel sector. I've been interested in sustainability for a long time and sit on a couple of industry bodies in the UK, the British Property Federation and the Investment Property Forum, on their sustainability committees.
Thanks, Siobhan. And last but not least, Robert.
Hello, I can't see myself. Robert Amchik, I'm from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. We are a specialist development bank or international financial institution set up to originally work in Eastern Europe, but work in basically North Africa, Central Asia, Middle East now, and expanding. I've been involved in ESG issues or ENS issues, particularly for the past 25 years. I've worked at Atkins, a regional director, developing various projects, and in the bank now for 17 years. And the focus is on assessing investments to make sure that there is no greenwashing, but also strengthening the sustainability side. I'm a member of the EU Platform for Sustainable Finance, and also on the forum of the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures, and looking quite a lot at the financial disclosures in terms of ESG issues or non-financial issues. Now they're becoming financial, with climate, of course, issues and TCFD.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robert, and thank you all. So we have just launched a poll, and I am wanting everyone in our audience to be paying attention to this, because I would be interested to hear your thoughts. So multiple answer: who is driving systematic ESG change? And you have options for government, investors, developers, owners, operators, brands or consumers. So please all cast your votes. We're going to leave this poll open throughout the webinar, and I'm going to be revealing the results at the end. So before we get started into the main conversation, I always like to highlight some context, and this is some stories that I published on Boutique Hotel News. And on this first slide here, you can see that green loans have recently been secured for single assets as well as larger regenerative projects. And we're going to touch on what the requirements are from ESG finance providers later on. And on this slide, we can also see how larger hotel chains are paying greater attention to their commitments as a company. And IHG, for example, has set out a 10-year plan which sees the company stand up for key issues such as diversity and inclusion, reducing energy use and carbon emissions, and waste and water management. Now, these commitments by IHG have been developed to contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I won't list all these goals because there's 17 of them, but the premise is that these goals provide a blueprint for a sustainable future by 2030. And if you've been watching COP26, over 1,000 cities globally have pledged to halve their emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2050. Now, on the next slide, we have the brand Room 2 launching what is claimed to be the world's first net zero carbon hotel next month. Now, net carbon zero within a building basically means that the carbon emissions associated with the construction and the operation of the end product is zero or negative. And we are going to be discussing later what the challenges are around retrofitting existing buildings compared to new build properties. So without further ado, why don't we talk about ESG in hotel investment and finance? And I'd like to begin with a question to Katrina, please. I mean, how has the last 20 months shaped the attitudes of brands, developers and operators towards ESG? I mean, are you seeing, for example, a greater number of hotels seek ESG guidance?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's been somewhat of a sea change in thinking around ESG, away from greenwashing and toward walking the walk, as we should we say. We have a lot of interest in Hotel Solutions Partnership from hoteliers seeking guidance on the matter. And we know that 14 of the leading hospitality providers, which represent 35,000 hotels, have joined a thing called the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance, or the SHA, and that the big global brands, such as IHG and Marriott and Accor, all have their own initiatives and are being very careful about reporting those initiatives and data on their performance now yearly.
I mean, is there a certain pinch point that you're finding amongst these clients that come to you, Katrina, in terms of the challenges that they are currently facing?
Yes, of course. I mean, some of our clients are still recovering, of course, from the global pandemic. So, they're worried about retaining staff. They're worried about bringing back, corporate clients. And so both of these things actually do have a connection to ESG, because we know that staff who are engaged in the hotel, if they feel good about their employer and that employer has ESG policies that benefit them, then it does help. The pinch point is really when you're a hotel owner that has a portfolio of old hotels or hotels that are in historical buildings, particularly here in London. The worry of retrofitting those to to reduce carbon emissions and the cost that might entail is a big pinch point.
Well, no doubt we are going to be touching on that later on today in our conversation. So let's then turn to look at the requirements for receiving any type of loan or funding, which brings me on to Robert. I mean, is it as simple as a tick box exercise? What are these requirements from ESG finance providers?
So I think, first of all, ESG is quite a broad definition. In fact, it probably still hasn't been fully legally tailored down. It's something going in to be done, I think, in the next months or by next year. But in terms of the financial requirements, in the past, as I think Katrina said, it was CSR, a bit more philanthropy, a bit of I feel good about, I'm going to invest or I'm going to have some good projects. Right now, it's becoming business critical and will become business critical. And that's in many ways the way the legislation is moving. We've just, of course, at COP, one of the announcements, and that has been announced, is of course the IFRS Foundation announcing the development of an international sustainability standards board. So we are looking at standardization, which will be, of course, sustainability ESG issues, and defining that further into one more definite criterion, because right now it's been a bit sort of, you could say, all over the shop. But what's happening at the European level, we have already the SFDR, which requires investors and asset managers to start to report on ESG information. We have TCFD, and of course through the IFRS Foundation, that will strengthen in terms of climate reporting. And that again, to have climate reporting means environmental. As Katrina said, is of course the social factors and the governance factors will come in. So in terms of whether financial sector is ticking the box, I'd say no longer. There will be compelled to do so through various mandatory regulatory requirements. At the EU level, there's the CSRD, which again will come in the next 2-3 years. The UK is, of course, looking at sustainability disclosures. So investors will have to disclose information. Climate in some ways first, more in the UK, climate in Europe a bit more holistic. The US has joined in, China is joining in, there's development of taxonomies. Therefore, it's a worldwide initiative that is is taking shape. And then over the next 2-3 years, the investors will need to have that data disclosed, which means they already have to prepare. So they will start asking more and more information. That, of course, the intention is, and the intention of the EU is to redirect capital into the green investments. And through the disclosures and reporting, and through definition of what is green, and this includes, of course, in this sector, there will be a view of channeling more funds, particularly long-term funds, into the sectors that can meet those criteria. We'll discuss a bit more what these criteria might be, but I think it's essential to look at that if you're a long-term investor, you have to take into account the long-term political agenda. G7, G20 have agreed certain aspects, climate first. We look at COP26, maybe we won't get many of our, what we wished for results. There will be some that will come out as what you could say, what used to be that, but the reporting, the need to disclose climate data, that is agreed. And that's, I think, a step, which is an important step. And that will mean that the entire financial sector, asset holders, investors, will look at that. So I think that's which way we're going right now in terms of it's no longer tick a box, it's actually getting information that is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Can I comment on that as well? I think where private finance is involved, they're increasingly using ESG metrics in their investment analytics, and so what that translates to is when modeling long-term returns from an investment. If you are not going down the road of ESG compliance, you will be perceived as more risky. And so that will be reflected in the discount rate being applied to the investment. So I think there is, private sector is looking at those quantifying risk now.
But I would add to that it's not only just that looking at the risk, because that's always been there. Some funds will just actively avoid certain areas if there's no information. So it's actually going to be a bit more, because if you want to brand yourself as a green investor, as somebody that is ESG focused, if your clients can't provide that data, you avoid them. And that is again going to be, I could say, a burden, but it's a 1-0. If you haven't got the data, you can't, we're not going to invest with you and move on. And that again will mean less access to capital.
May I I ask, Robert, what role certification plays in this? I know we've had a question come through about, you know, things like BREEAM and LEED. Would these be accepted as data?
And there is data, these will be accepted as one of the factors. And this is where I think on the ESG side, having a certificate that you meet certain standards does not mean that you fully adhere to everything. And in the same way, you can have a BREEAM certificate, you can actually have various management systems, but is your social side addressed? And then you've got the physical risks that actually investors will look at on the climate side. And the physical risk, are you subject or potentially prone to flooding, sea rise, and how will you adapt to that? Is that something that you can actually disclose and provide information in? On the social side, as also Katerina said, there's going to be a lot of issues. Do you have forced labor, more or less? Are you employing and paying a fair wage? The social pressures are increasing. And I think there is going to be, and the post-pandemic world is, people will look at these issues more than they did before. Doesn't mean that there will be social justice, but there will be, unfortunately, but there will be, I think, a more clarity and at least requests to say, is there minimum wage? Are you paying your taxes? Are you actually ensuring that passports are not withheld, particularly in some countries, from your actually staff and cleaning staff? Are they being treated well? And that will then percolate to the investors and the asset managers. And probably the owners might not see the need for that as much, but the asset managers will think about it. It's a bit like working with people like Coca-Cola or some of the top brands in terms of clothing. They'll do audits of where they come out, because reputationally for them to find out that the supplier is actually not providing right information is quite a big blow. And they do have these every so often. The same will be with financial and asset managers. We won't want to invest or have assets that could be tainted and reputationally impact us.
Mm-hmm. This, I think, leads into a much wider question, and I think I asked this on our pre-call, and I'd be interested to hear from our audience what they think as to what's more important, the E, the S, or the G of ESG, and to break that down, E meaning environmental, S being social, and G being your corporate governance. So I'll be interested to hear people's thoughts off the back of what we've already been talking about. And I'd like to shift the conversation on to start looking at how regulations might start to impact what it means to own and develop a hotel, which brings me on to Siobhan. So let's look at government rules and regulations then. I mean, how could this and will this impact developing and owning hotel property?
Thanks, Eloise. Yeah, good question. We know that in the UK, we've got a legally binding commitment under the Climate Change Act to get to net zero by 2050. And I think 18 of the G20 countries have now joined us in that. The Climate Change Act is one of the earliest statutory mechanisms for fixing that. And we've got a series of 5-yearly carbon budgets set by the Climate Change Committee and approved by Parliament. They've just approved the one for 2033 to 37. So that's fine. We have this target as a country, but there's no individual targets on anyone at the moment to meet net zero. And the government obviously has to now consider what regulation they're putting in place across the economy to get there. And so if we're looking at the built environment and we're looking at new builds, which is what you've asked about, we have building regulations which govern the standards to which buildings have to be built. And there have been consultations both for residential and commercial property, which clearly signal a huge ramping up of building standards by 2025 with interim uplifts by 2022. Very much designed to increase the energy efficiency of buildings and the fabric and the services in buildings, but also to make those buildings net zero carbon ready for decarbonisation of the grid more generally, or possibly hydrogen heating or whatever will be the right way forward. So those are coming down the line. And obviously developments take 5 years probably from conception to completion. And so anyone developing now, although we don't have full visibility over what's happening, needs to be taking those higher standards into account. The standards are supposed to reduce emissions by about 70% from where we are now in terms of new build standards. We've also had, at the end of October, we finally had the heat and building strategy from the UK government. And that, for the first time, sets out how we're going to decarbonise the source of energy in buildings. And that makes it clear that we're looking at phasing out new installations of fossil fuel heating or new connections to the grid by roughly the mid-2020s, with possible absolute sort of prohibitions of further fossil fuel or gas grid connections entirely, not just for new systems, but for existing systems in the sort of 2030s, late 2030s. So we can see on new builds that we've got A, the fabric of the building dealt with by new building regulations, and B, decarbonisation of the fuel source coming down the line. I know in the EU, they have committed to net zero by 2050, and they have a target to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030. And they've just been consulting on requirements for new builds along the similar lines as our building regulations, and they're expected to publish something by the end of this year. So definite kind of regulatory things coming down the line in relation to new builds. Yeah.
And to add to that, do you think that down the line it's going to be likely that non-sustainable buildings will eventually become taxed, given the imminent pressure of these regulations?
Yeah, I think in the UK, there's, how do you tax something that's not sustainable? You could do it very straightforwardly through a carbon tax, but we don't have that in the UK just for anything other than the energy sector or high emitting industry, heavy industry. There's been some push for that, for it to be spread more widely, some sort of carbon tax, but the government has pulled back from that in a recent consultation. But in the context of the real estate sector in particular, there's a number of regulatory kind of initiatives that I can talk about later, but the government has made it very clear that if those initiatives don't produce the carbon emissions that they're expected to produce, then the government will start looking at financial incentives or penalties. And I mean, that could take various forms in the real estate sector. It could take, there could be differential stamp duty rates on the acquisition of buildings. There could be different rating rates applied for building rates paid by buildings. There could be differential VAT rates depending on kind of works to buildings. New builds could attract the higher VAT rate. Retrofits could attract a lower VAT rate. There could even, potentially be differences in corporation tax rates for sustainable and non-sustainable companies. So, and I know that there are some property companies already, although we don't have a carbon tax, building in a price for carbon tons in all of their decisions that they make around new builds, so that they are building that consideration in and deciding whether the new build is worth it in that context. And as Robert's mentioned, we have lots of other drivers other than tax drivers or regulatory drivers. We have the reporting drivers that he's mentioned. We have increasingly in the UK, amongst various local authorities who obviously set their own planning policies, we have requirements for net zero. The London plan, for instance, if you're developing something major in London at the moment that's more than 1,000 square meters, the London plan policy says that that should be net zero carbon operationally, and that your emissions reductions targets or your energy efficiency should seek to go beyond what's required by the building regulations. And I think we'll see that extending to other local authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So, can I just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Robert.
No, please.
Well, what Siobhan has mentioned there has just kind of sparked a sort of fear that I think some of the hoteliers will be worried about, which is having to do with, quantifying carbon emissions under scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, right? So scope 1 being, emissions from your on-site operation, the building and the operation. Scope 2 being, I think, emissions from people who work. Just correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, because you're probably more into this than I am. But it's a sort of wider environment that you're operating in, the emissions that you're producing from, say, your supply chain, your employees that come to work in your building, and scope 3 being from the wider context of, let's say, your customers coming to stay in your hotel. So, I mean, how are we going to compute all of this and influence it and control it? I mean, if I'm a big conference hotel that that hosts large conferences of people that come from very far away, how am I going to mitigate their carbon emissions?
Well, that I think you said. I mean, the scope 3 is going to be the hardest. It's the entire sort of customer and approach is hardest to do. Scope 1 is easiest, and scope 2 you can through the electricity use. But that's, I think, where we are coming in is we have been accustomed for the past period of time of quite cheap energy. And energy is suddenly shooting up in a very sort of well, it's gas prices in the magnitude. So this area of increased energy prices, and therefore both fossil but also renewable, and it will also have pressures in terms of which buildings and how investments are looked at. Energy is going to be, I think, a key focus, and then how you report it, whether that energy is green or not, in your actual portfolio, will be that sort of a double whammy, you could say, whereby first of all you have to pay it, and pay quite a lot, and if it is not from renewable, you'd have to disclose it in a negative way. So in some ways, although the market not always works, but will also put pressures in terms of which buildings are developed and how they're used. In some ways, there will also be funds, and there'll be regional funds, and the EU is working on various issues on renovation, and that is going to be looked at as well, because that has, all buildings have a cultural and heritage value that needs to be put in place. In the same way as we're trying to look at the just transition in terms of regions where it's depending on coal mining, for instance, how do you do the transition? And the transition will be, I think, a buzzword that will come over. How do we transit? How some of the funds will be seen as at least do no significant harm, but have a positive view, but might not be contributing to significant changes. It's in the EU nomenclature. So that, I think, is going to be pushed, and we'll see how it goes. But there will be a general view is, of course, financing will want to go for the best, and long-term financing even more, to ensure that there's stability for the investor and the risks are addressed. And we will only see, I think, energy prices go up, not down. So energy efficiency is going to be a major issue to look at.
And just one other point there on scopes of emissions. I think, where you've got an owner who is reporting scope 3 emissions, the emissions down its supply chain, I think that's going to have to lead to much bigger collaboration between owners and operators of hotels around the energy use in hotels, which will be a good thing, if people are collaborating and working together to reduce demand for energy.
Mm-hmm. We've had a question come in from Colin asking, at what point does market collaboration become anti-competitive? And I know that one of the stories that I had on my context slide was from Deutsche Bank, who was arguing that we need a global rule book on how we should measure and develop and implement this, because at the moment there's no one singular, I understand, overarching body that's responsible for pulling all this together. To move on to Robert, to ask about funding, where do you think future funding is going to come from, Robert, for ESG projects? And do you think larger banks will become willing to lend more directly?
Well, it is a bit of a crystal ball, always looking what will the future be, and in terms of where financing will be, there's certain things we can't predict. But overall, the financial industry will be looking at financing, as I said, those projects which will meet those criteria. And there is also, we're seeing much more blended finance, particularly outside Europe, and investment on that side going in different areas. There'll be a lot of government funding as well. We're seeing actually the role of government in many ways increasing rather than decreasing, which was a trend. And right now, also because of, well, quantitative easing, and we need governments to help out. So this side of, in some countries where I operate, it's actually, there's more money than projects. And that is quite an issue. So of course, the best projects are subject to a lot of interest from different parties. So financing will be there, hopefully, but it is therefore then, of course, all financial institutions and banks will want to finance into the best. So the lowest risk, and lowest risk will also include the climate issues, the ESG issues, not just the returns on that side. So it's, I think, going to be an area where the funding will be, but what the industry has to do, and that's, I think, where it's to define and help to define for both the regulators, be it the EU, but also UK, or throughout, because the taxonomies and the international standard setting is happening. And as I mentioned, the IFRS Foundation, the International Sustainable Standards Board being developed, is bringing in, and that will be an accounting requirement. And most businesses will need to have an accounts filled in, audited to a certain standard. And I think this is going to where the pressures will come in, is to define what KPIs should be developed to define what is a green project. And that is a big challenge, because of course you sometimes get two experts and end up with three opinions, and particularly on certain areas which are still fluid, on the energy use, on the biodiversity impacts, on the supply chains, and then you have, of course, add the social governance and issues as well. And that, I think, is but this is where industry has to step up, is to help to define those, help to agree, and then help to channel those investments, because everybody's accepted, and this is the difference. 5 years ago, and or even in mine 10 years ago, the view of climate change was, well, there is something. Right now, we have all leaders of G7 saying it is, and accepting that. It is, I think, the general public worldwide has accepted that there is climatic issues, and that there is, therefore, the ESG side is important. It's no longer something nice to have. It is becoming existential, in particularly for many regions and many peoples. So that shift has caused, I think, an opportunity as well for the industry to as well develop own standards, own KPIs, and be proactive, versus something which was a bit of a fad 10 years ago. It was not. It was something, a niche market. Right now, it's going to go from a niche market to your standard market operations. And I think that's the big change, that 10 years ago, sustainability, ecotourism was a niche. It was for certain, quite often, rather the richer clients and the sector, or you could say the more the student type, but now it's become, everybody wants it, and you've got actually the not niche, is the outliers are those that don't care, and will be, even package holidays will start to push this side very much. So I think that is an opportunity to develop. It will mean that not everybody will survive. And that, I think, is, again, if you don't change, you won't survive. It's in the same way, if you're a coal industry right now, you're not want to be investing in a new coal mine. It's something that hasn't got a future. So in terms of the hospitality side, it again will be as well, who can provide and demonstrate and develop those KPIs. And those KPIs will be moving if we look at the 2030 targets already, 2050 as well.
And Robert, whilst we're with you, can you see that funding, or what's the current landscape at the moment in terms of smaller projects, for example, where a full project finance might not be applicable due to small scale?
Well, for instance, as EBRD, we will finance bigger projects. And in many ways, we're looking at the project 10 million plus euros, and therefore it has to have a certain size. Sometimes it might go down to 5, but it's actually to develop those projects is more difficult. But we have, through financial intermediaries, we do provide funding, and this is where you will have both the banking side having credit lines for specific investments. We do that a lot with gender, for instance, support in certain countries, but it will be also in terms of energy efficiency, providing energy efficiency loans where the payback can be quite quick. And in fact, offering them through technical assistance to do free energy efficiency audits. So these areas will be coming in where we can provide some of the assistance, particularly to the smaller and again, the countries we operate. But there are other institutions that will be doing the same, where there is a possibility to help with the energy audit, help with social side. Gender side is a big issue in many countries, and then of course provide on commercial values just loans, but smaller sizes. And that there will be also a lot of international but EU money coming in. Of course, UK maybe my colleagues can discuss a bit more on the UK side, because they're based in London, we work more outside London, so it's sometimes have a different view and perspective.
Yeah, Eloise, I know that in recent times there have been lots of institutions reporting deals. So the whole kind of green finance and green bonds becoming available is really on the radar screen of anyone developing a hotel and looking for finance now. Not just the banks providing ESG linked loans, where, of course, accreditation with LEED, BREEAM is important, but also having an ESG strategy, a reporting system, and adhering to ESG principles is part of the application process. But also, companies such as, say, Aviva, announcing that they're planning to lend, £1 billion over the next 4 years. The IFC looking to double their investment in, I think they invested 18 billion or so in hotels already. And, some of the bigger funds looking to provide large, who have already provided green loans to large development companies. So I think it's out there, it's available, and there will be institutions competing for the high quality projects.
Mm-hmm. And
I think just to add, it's the capital markets, the green bond is a huge area that is developing. Again, the development of criteria will change, and I think the EU is trying to clarify some issues on the green bond standard, because we have the ICMA guidelines right now. But these are areas where I think, but they're for bigger projects, they're not for the smaller projects, but there is a huge appetite, and there's a huge appetite because many investors want to hold on to green, certificates, or have the green investments, and that they can actually put in their portfolios that they have invested in the green projects. And a lot of the green projects are very good, and that's why people invest in them, because the sustainability quite often has required better governance, better standards. But that's where the danger is when something becomes more popular, that the greenwashing becomes quite a big risk. So I think this is something we'll all be watching out as to how to avoid greenwashing, how to ensure that there's standards and verifications, and that we uphold those, because people will, we all have, I think, greenwashing problems, and that is inevitable. But that doesn't mean it's a bad product, but humanity is as it is, and people will try to take advantage, and we just need to be vigilant and ensure that we keep the standards in the right way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robert. I'd like to come back to Katrina, because it sounds like this is more of a marathon than it is a sprint, but change is around the corner, and I think steps that you can take now is going to future-proof, if you like, your business. So Katrina, what advice would you give to an independent operator to prepare right now for meeting ESG standards?
Well, I think independent operators, obviously they'll be watching what the big brands are doing. I think they, starting down the road to ESG compliance, setting targets or revisiting targets you already have, putting into place, sustainable operating policies and procedures, measuring tools to, setting KPIs as for energy use, waste, and putting into place methods for procuring more circular, products that have a sort of circular use, you can be reused. They need to have I think companies have to have a strategy. They need to have a roadmap, setting out the targets. They need to be putting into place monitoring. And also training is very important. You're only as good as your people. And so I think there needs to be buy-in from the whole hotel management and down the rank and file in your team to create a sort of a culture that this is a good thing. Now, the benefits are great. You can boost your profits, your profit margins through the savings you might make in utilities, when in places where the governments will be providing incentives. In some countries, such as Australia, for example, there is a VAT refund for units that operate that are ESG compliant. And of course, as we've just been discussing, going down this track then opens you up to green financing, and can in the long term increase the value of your property, because again, in that computation, if you're operating to if you're aware of the ESG standards and operating to those standards, you may also be attracting clientele to your hotel because they believe in that. Or I think it's something like 35% of North American corporates now have a policy in place for selecting accommodation based on ESG principles. So there's an actual benefit to this financially that independent operators need to be focused on.
And can the costs of transforming an asset or a hotel within green building certifications, can this be estimated in advance?
Funny you ask that, because that's exactly what we thanks for asking the question. But more seriously, yes, they can be estimated in advance. I mean, the big fear is, oh, it's going to be so costly, but in fact, I've seen some surveys that show that the cost can represent, between 1 to 10% cost increase, actually, of retrofitting. When you look at the long-term gains you'll make from utility savings and staff retention and things like that. So I think the IFC has a software that evaluates the performance of existing buildings and helps you look at areas where improvements can be made. And of course, all of these accreditations, LEED, BREEAM, WELL, they do have their, there is a cost to accrediting there. There is you do have to have a team, appoint a project team that is, very familiar with all of these accreditation schemes. The costs of certifying can range between, £2,000 to as much as, £34,000, depending on the size of your project. And then, of course, you'll have assessor fees and you'll have the tracking fees every year.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
But maybe I'd just like to ask the question about more funds than projects. There are of course more projects than funds, but what I'm had in mind is the good projects, those that have all the sort of are prepared and packaged. There's more people willing to invest in those than the average project, and that's where you've got the situation of actually preparing some of those documents, packaging things in the right way, preparing the documentation for financing. If you do it in the right way, as they say, line up your ducks in the right way and ensure that you have the permits, you have the certificates, you can demonstrate that the land has been acquired. Depends where you are it's not in a green belt, or it's not somewhere outside creating biodiversity impacts, is going to attract more interest than a project that will just be a good project but not have the documents in the right place. And that, I think, is when I said more funds, and particularly in some of the countries where we work, there are many projects, but we can't find many. I mean, and also sometimes you've got from our integrity side is who's the owner or who the shareholders, and if they're government officials or others, it becomes very difficult for us to invest. But the integrity side is then becomes a key issue. But it is that side. Preparing projects is not just having a minimum standard. And I think the way with ESG that's going, the actual upfront work, make sure you prepare it and present it. It's the presentations has to take that slightly different angle, and then you can actually a good project can find more funding and financing than just an average project.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robert. Thanks for clarifying. I'd like to go back to our discussion around existing buildings, and it's tailing on from what Katrina just said, and I'd like to bring Siobhan back into the conversation here to ask, what are the UK regulatory drivers that are going to affect the implementation of ESG principles within those existing buildings? We've touched on retrofitting already, so I'd like to pick your brains about that.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, so I've previously talked about what applies to new builds. In fact, we have much more regulation in existence and coming down the line in relation to existing buildings. And I think that follows what's known as the energy hierarchy. You know, what we need to do first is reduce demand and use the energy we've got more efficiently. And then you look at kind of renewables and offsetting. So just looking at existing buildings, the regulation we've got around that is the requirement for energy performance certificates on sale, letting, new construction. On top of that, we now have the energy performance certificates forming the bedrock of minimum energy efficiency standards. So you cannot let a building in the UK without an EPC E grade. At the moment, and that will apply, this is talking about commercial buildings, that will apply to all existing and new lettings from 2023. And we have very, very clear signals from the government now that that trajectory is going to ramp up to an EPC B as the requirement for lawful lettings by 2030. So there is a lot of retrofit work to be done to buildings that need to be let by 2030, and there are exemptions within those regulations, which we don't really have time to go into today. But you know, the fundamental position is that you should be having an EPC-B by 2030. So that's on the energy performance certificates. Energy performance certificates model the theoretical ability of the building to perform and in an energy efficient way. And what industry has been calling for, and what we now have, is a consultation on a performance-based rating. Which will actually measure the energy use in buildings. Now that's going to be introduced, it said, for offices from 22-23, and then other commercial sectors after that. And it will result in either the owner occupier or the tenant of whole, so very relevant where you've got leased hotel assets, having to report annually their energy use, which will then be benchmarked within their sector, and that will be publicly that information will be publicly available. So you start seeing reputational drivers around the actual energy use, another driver for owners and operators to work together there. So, and then we've talked about the heat and building strategy, which moves away from the retrofitting to actually the decarbonisation and that's going to apply to existing buildings as well. The EU is doing very similar things by looking at their environmental performance of building directive and ramping up minimum energy efficiency standards. Robert's talked about disclosure requirements, and I think that's having an increasing effect on, you know, the need to retrofit. And major property companies now are really cognizant of the fact that, you know, there is a need to retrofit existing assets and not just build new ones.
Mm-hmm. So how do you weigh up then whether to retrofit or repurpose or in fact redevelop a building? I mean, what factors do you consider, Siobhan?
I mean, ultimately, and I can see we're running short of time, I think you need to do a carbon audit of the two alternative options. You know, the retrofitting option, you may be able to produce, with a new build, you may be able to produce something that's much more energy efficient in operation, but you've got to take into account the embodied carbon that's involved in actually creating that new asset versus the embodied carbon that's involved, which will be much less, I suspect, in retrofitting and repurposing something that already exists.
Mm-hmm. Whilst I'm with you, Siobhan, we've got I know you alluded to earlier the difference between management contracts and leases and what the implications are between the tenants or the owner operator. Is there evidence on how hotel management agreements are evolving around ESG issues? And if not, where do you expect these changes to be?
I did ask one of my colleagues who spends his life doing hotel management agreements earlier, and he didn't think he was seeing huge amounts of ESG things going into hotel management agreements at the moment, but I'm sure that will change. And if you look at the lease sector, you know, there's been a big push around green leases. We've been talking about them for 10 years. In the last 12 months, clients have really become interested in them. And I suspect the same sorts of provisions that one would put in a green lease would be appropriate with the necessary tweaks for a hotel management agreement.
Yeah, can I just comment on that?
Yeah.
I think where we'll see some action is in the performance tests that are being set now by owners on operators. So if an owner has green finance and that is linked to ESG KPIs, those KPIs need to be translated and reflected in the management contracts. And so the performance tests that will no longer, I think, should no longer be just focused on profitability. There will be performance targets set relating to ESG as well, I think.
Whilst I've got you, Katrina, I'm just going to ask one final question around building certifications. How do you establish which certification is right for your business? I know we've talked earlier about how they can feed into your case, if you like, for receiving funding or financing. So what's your advice, Katrina?
Ooh, that's a really big question. Okay, so if you're doing a new build, of course, you have a choice of globally accepted certifications, LEED and BREEAM and WELL being quite well known. I think there's one called EDGE as well. But in terms of how widely they're accepted, I mean, globally, BREEAM has about, and this is from my friends at Mace who told me about this, that, you know, there are about 240,000 hotels or projects certified or in application with BREEAM. LEED is 135,000 and WELL has 24,000. So that gives you a view on how widely accepted they are. And of course, it'll be linked probably to where you are developing, the government that you're having to pay attention to.
Well, thank you. As Siobhan mentioned just a minute ago, we are fast approaching our allotted hour, but I would like to finish off by reading out our poll results. We've just closed that, and I know it popped up very briefly on your screens, but I took a screenshot. So the poll question: who is driving systematic ESG change? The overwhelming, well, I say overwhelming majority, the majority, 33%, have voted consumers. followed by 30% investors, followed by 24% government. We have a joint 7% for owners, operators and brands, and 0% for developers. So thank you all for voting. Rather insightful there, but we must close off our conversation today. Thank you to Katrina, Siobhan and Robert for all your insights. I am just going to run through some short slides before we close the webinar today. I'd just like to highlight that I'm back on Monday for the next webinar called The Changing Role of the General Manager, and the link to sign up has been popped into the chat. I would love to see you all there. And if you would like to hear further information about any of our webinars on Boutique Hotel News, please do get in touch with my colleague Katie. Her contact details are up on your screen and they have been popped into the chat as well. So once again, thank you, Siobhan, Robert and Katrina. Thank you to those that have tuned in live and submitted their questions. As I mentioned, I'll be back on Monday. We are going to leave the webinar open for an extra 2 minutes, just for anyone who is watching to follow up on any of the links, any of the questions, any of the comments, to connect with our panelists today. But otherwise, enjoy the weekend ahead. I know it's only Thursday, but I'm an optimist. And I will see you all very soon, and do take care.